The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of FRCMedia, Bristol Community College, or the City of Fall River.
It's Thursday, July 4th, 2024. This is FRC Media News. I'm Keith Tebow. We hope you're enjoying your Independence Day holiday. We're going to do something a little different again on this week's show. You may remember 3 weeks ago, we had a special presentation that looked at the history of presidential elections. Well, we're going to continue that this week with a look at the history of political parties in the United States, as well as a look at the Republican Party as it prepares for its national convention later this month. Joining me, as he did 3 weeks ago, is Don Kilguss, the Assistant Professor of History and Government at Bristol Community College. When we spoke on our first program, we touched briefly upon political parties,
right,
and how when the country first started in the first few presidential elections, there were no political parties. It was the top two vote getters, if you will, and the Electoral College became president and vice president.
Correct.
So give us a little background about how parties again got started.
Okay, great, yeah. Actually, political parties were not even mentioned in the Constitution itself. The Founding Fathers didn't even want political parties as a part of our system because they were concerned about trying to bring the country together at that point in time. John Adams had a great quote where he said, what we need to do is try and get the country, these 13 separate clocks to strike as one. So they were focused more on the unity aspect, and they believed parties would just be divisive and really divide us as a nation before we even got started, before we even became unified as a nation and had a clear mindset and a path for the future.
Yeah.
Well, what happened though in the 1790s when Alexander Hamilton developed his plan, his fiscal plan for the nation under George Washington's presidency, that created a great question about what is the future of this country going to be. And therefore the political parties began evolving separately over their vision of what the future is going to be, because that's what political parties are really all about. The point of political parties is to obviously develop an agenda and then win office and to put that agenda into effect. But every political party in the United States believes in the same thing, basically. They all want the same thing, is how I should say it.
Right.
They want the good society. They want America to be healthy, strong, prosperous, and so on and so forth. Yeah. How do you get there, though? That's what they differ on. Lowering taxes, raising taxes,
right,
doing this or doing that. And what we've, as a product again of the British system, the two-party system made sense for us and it evolved organically in the United States as a result.
Yeah, I want to talk a little about that. There used to be many parties. I remember the Whigs, years ago. I mean, how did it evolve to get to where we are today, where there's two primary political parties?
Correct. Well, there always were two primary parties.
Okay.
The first two parties were the Federalists, also known as the Hamiltonians, or the Democratic Republicans, which always confuses everybody, or better known also as the Jeffersonians. They really were the two major parties with the two major philosophical differences leading right up until the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, the Federalist Party basically committed political suicide during the war, and they kind of disappeared as an entity. So we really had for a brief time one political party. Everyone technically was a Democratic Republican. Well, if everyone is technically a Democratic Republican, then no one is really a Democratic Republican.
Right.
And what happened as a result, around the person and the personality of Andrew Jackson, a new party emerged. That became the modern Democratic Party. In opposition to Jackson, his person and his policies, a new party emerged because they believed this was King Andrew I was in control. Right. So they adopted the old British term for their party that was opposed to the monarchy, which was the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S,
right,
exactly. That party, and those were the two major parties right up until the 1850s. What happened, though, is the slavery issue. And slavery, of course, divided the nation north and south, and it also divided the political parties. And by 1854, we see the modern Republican Party was born with its agenda, with its program as being opposed to slavery itself, opposed to slavery's expansion into the territories, and also the idea of the ability and the freedom to compete for work and labor. And that was all encapsulated in their slogan, free labor, free soil, free labor, free men. And they, after that, from 1854 onward, we have the Republican Party being the more liberal of the two parties, which again, everyone of this generation, right. And the Democrats being the more conservative party until both parties flipped as a result of the election of 1912. The Republicans went more conservative as a result. The Democrats went obviously more liberal, if you will. And that's kind of where we stand right now.
You talked about the evolution. You know, we've been in this Democrat-Republican two-party system from the mid-1800s. Why wasn't there more evolution? I mean, there's evolution between the two, amongst the two parties, but there was no evolution in terms of one of those parties going by the wayside, like the Federalists. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they entrenched themselves, well enough, in the years. After the Republican Party was founded in 1854, Lincoln was elected president, as we know, in 1860. The successful Republican Party won the Civil War, preserved the Union as a consequence. So I think that gave them a great deal of stability and obviously power to maintain themselves through the patronage system, through the federal bureaucracy and so on and so forth. The Democratic Party had been so entrenched to begin with as well prior to the Civil War, and then as soon as Reconstruction ended, they became re-entrenched once again in the southern states. Today, again, that's all different. That's, after 1964, 65, there's been a more Republican resurgence in the South as well, exactly.
Well, I want to focus this first program of the next two. We're going to focus on the Republican Party because their Republican convention is coming up toward the middle of July. I believe July 15th to the 18th is going to be in Milwaukee. With the parties, we hear a lot now every 4 years. The conventions are a big part of the political year, presidential political year. There haven't been conventions since the beginning of the American government, has there? I mean, conventions themselves are still relatively new in some ways.
Well, this is part of the evolution, as you mentioned before, about the evolution of the political parties. And also something, just to go back to your question before, I think it's interesting to keep in mind too, that because of the two-party system that we have entrenched here, that encourages the parties that are not in power to come up with real alternatives, as opposed when you only have a one-party that's in control of a state or the federal government, let's say, where it becomes more petty and more, more personal in terms of the attacks. So what also has provided this stability is, as third parties have evolved throughout American history, the two major parties can recognize and see they have a certain message, they have a certain niche of who they're appealing to, and that encourages the major parties to reach out and try and grab those supporters as well. That goes along with the conventions, because the first convention was actually held not by the Democrats, not by the Whigs, but actually by a third party called the Anti-Mason Party, which, as the name implies, was opposed to Masons, the fraternal organization. And then what happened is the other parties began picking up on that as well, because what people wanted to do is try to bring the process back to the American people, in the sense that the earliest process, as you alluded to, was what was called the King Caucus, or the Congressional Caucus method, where it would be the members of each party in Congress who would choose who the presidential candidates would be, which again sounded like it worked for the time and sounded okay, it might be efficient and practical, but it actually violates some of the basic ideas of the separation of powers between the lawmaking, the law enforcing, judicial branches, and so on. And also it gave the people no say. So at least the conventions, initially, they were supposed to be all about choosing who the candidates would be. Today, now that we've shifted, and the primaries really are the mechanisms that determine, the conventions are now much more so about presenting yourself, having those 3-4 days and nights to package your candidate, introduce the candidate, which we don't need this year because we know both of the individuals, but package your candidate and introduce the candidate to the American people. Come up with a platform, put your best foot forward so that you can try to appeal to all of those voters, not just those that are core Democrat or Republican voters, but those who might be on the fence and say, well, yes, our party is welcoming. We are reaching out to you. And that's where, again, they would reach out to maybe some of those older third parties in the past and say, okay, well, your agenda and you're focusing on this or you're focusing on that aspect. Let's beg, borrow, steal some of these aspects.
Yeah. You mentioned how, the selection of a president during the primaries is more of a democratic process, small d, in terms of selecting the president. And when the conventions first start, every state is represented, correct? They have delegates that go to these conventions. How are those delegates selected? And has it changed over years?
Well, it definitely has changed over years. In the past, prior to, again, the primaries really becoming the mechanism in 1972 and forward, really was the party bosses, those that controlled the parties at the state, and local levels. They and their cronies were the ones who really were the kingmakers, literally, in terms of who the presidential nominees would be for each party. So you saw that, and as the primaries, which were really introduced during the progressive era in the early 20th century, began to catch on, and people began to say that we need a little bit more of a say in this process, that we now can directly elect senators, which we never could originally. That didn't happen until the early 1900s. Now that we can do this, and now that we can look at electing our governors and electing all the other state leaders, we should have a greater say, not these party leaders, in who's actually choosing who these presidential nominees are going to be. So that took the power away from those individuals and gave it more to the people. But in each of these primaries, and again, each party has their own different math and how they figure it out. But each party chooses a set of delegates, and based upon who wins, each candidate gets a certain number of delegates to the convention. So you don't necessarily have to win every primary in order to win and become the candidate, but you need to, especially in the first several primaries, you need to win, be in the top 1, 2, 3 to make yourself viable and make yourself continue moving forward. As we're going to talk about the Republicans here in a second, Nikki Haley, I mean, she stuck it out to the end because she was always finishing in that second spot. So it's interesting to see, how that plays out. Obviously, Trump has, the majority now, when they come and meet at the convention in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So.
What can people expect to see? I know it's evolved over the years. Prior to, as you mentioned, the primaries being the key determinator of who the nominees are, selecting of the president would actually happen. I mean, at these conventions where there was. Nobody knew really in some of these conventions who was going to be the nominee. A lot of talk about backroom deals and the like. So I guess now it's different, as you said. Now it's more of a showcase of the nominee, the party, to those people who may not have made the decision in terms of who they may vote for in November. But what will people expect to see over those 4 days? In both conventions? Obviously the nuances are different. We'll get back to the Republicans in a minute. But what do people expect to see when they watch these conventions?
Well, one of the first things, as the parties are determining where they go, that sometimes site selection can be a very, very important determinant.
Where they're actually holding the convention.
Where they're holding the convention can be a big thing. For example, this year, the Republicans are in Wisconsin, the Democrats are in Chicago, Illinois. So Wisconsin was chosen because that's a big swing state for the Republicans coming up. The Democrats look at Illinois and Chicago as a very strong part of the blue wall, as they call it. So that's something, as you'll see from the beginning, and you'll see some of the history of those two states, and that will really be a way for the candidates and the parties to sell themselves to those voters within those two states in particular, in addition to across the nation, obviously. You also will see that what happens is there's always a temporary officers are chosen just for the convention. And the person who's elected president of the convention will actually give the keynote address. And once that person gives the keynote, which is for both parties, which will kind of set the tone for where they're going in terms of the convention and who is going to eventually become the nominee, then what happens is the individuals are nominated, they're seconded, and then what happens is the delegates will actually vote. And then, as we know, as we said, for the Republicans and Democrats, it's kind of a foregone conclusion who's going to be it, who's going to be the candidate now. However, what is interesting is that the acceptance speeches will come after the official nominations come in. And what's interesting is that they were not done in person. the acceptance speeches were always sent and then were read by someone who was a loyalist, a supporter of the particular candidate.
Sort of a surrogate.
Correct. It was a surrogate. That's exactly right. Because these individuals, too, keep in mind, didn't actively campaign up until the early 20th century, very late 19th, early 20th century, because that was seen to be below them. You stand for office and you put yourself out there and the people come to you to some extent as opposed to you going to the people to some extent.
Right.
So what's going to happen here is then the acceptance speeches. The first person to do it, which he did many firsts, was Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. He heard that he had won the nomination, and he got on a plane from Albany, New York. He was the governor of New York, and he flew to Chicago to accept the nomination in person. That had never happened before. To get up there, deliver it, they turned the lights off, and then all of a sudden he was there at the podium, the lights were on. It created this aura, that's first of one of the many dramatic things he will do during his presidency. The Republicans will follow suit and give their acceptance speech in person beginning in 1944, and it's happened ever since.
Yeah. One of the things that we see with the delegates that are going to be, you mentioned each party has their own rules in terms of number of delegates and how they're apportioned and the like. In the Republican convention, there's 2,429 delegates. So they need to get a majority. In this case, former President Trump will need to get a majority. 1215 is the key number. And that's also the case for whoever the vice presidential nominee may be as well, right? There's a separate vote for that individual as well.
There will be, absolutely. And seeing that's where some of the drama is coming in here with the Republicans coming up shortly.
Year, correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Because former President Trump has not announced who he is going to have as his vice presidential nominee. That person will normally be accepted very readily. Normally they announce the vice presidential choice a week or so or 2 weeks before, but I think former President Trump has said he wants to do it actually at the convention himself.
Which has been a tradition.
Will be interesting.
Because even I remember growing up in the 70s, you would hear of vice presidential nominees being announced. I believe Reagan was one of them in 1980. He announced George Bush at the convention. I believe if I remember right, he actually went on stage and told everyone, my nominee is going to be George Bush. I mean, he made a brief appearance, I believe. So this is nothing new in terms of announcing a vice presidential nominee later in the process.
No, it's not. It's not. But it's interesting. I think it's trying to draw up that little drama, make it a little bit more interesting, try and bring people in to the convention. So then not only do you get attracted by who the vice president nominee will be, but also to see, okay, what else is the Republican Party about at this time? So this is why it's all geared towards the media. These conventions now, it's all about the media. It was always about, the print media back in the 19th century, the early 20th century, about the radio, and now it's always about TV and how you can, control that message. And what's interesting is the last time they allowed, now I'm not saying, Trump is doing this, but the last time they actually allowed a convention to choose a vice president was back in 1956. Adlai Stevenson allowed the Democratic convention to choose who his running mate would be. And I think, we're not going to see that obviously happen. But I think it's interesting to see that I think they're trying to draw up a little bit more interest and try and draw a few more people in. And it'll be interesting to see, who he chooses, because the vice presidential choice has always been about balance. In the past, it was about geographically. So north and south, or east and west, or whatever the case may be. Then it became more about experience and about, if you're someone who's has more domestic experience or foreign policy experience, then you go for a vice president that has the opposite credentials to try and help you in that regard. These days, it might be about balancing you in other ways. It could be balancing in terms of gender or race or other kinds of things as well. So it'll be interesting to see, who Trump actually decides to choose. Obviously, it's a pretty much foregone conclusion that Biden is going to, and Harris will be the ticket for the Democrats. I mean, there hasn't been someone who has changed an incumbent who has changed vice presidential nominees since the 1940s, since
FDR,
Roosevelt. Since Roosevelt.
Another thing about the pomp and circumstance of the conventions is, I'm one of those people who will watch very intently, but my eyes will roll a lot because when they do the roll call of the states, every state has their, what they want to mention. State of Rhode Island, the home of calamari. Remember during the 2020 when they were remote, the Democrats, and that's all part of the pomp and circumstance as well. So there's a lot of showcasing.
The funny hats, the different slogans, all those kinds of things are all part of what a convention's all about. The convention is almost like Mardi Gras for politics, because it's a big party, but there's a lot of serious work that has to take place as well in terms of the platform creation and things of that sort. This case, nominating the candidate is still essential, even though it's kind of, as we said, a foregone conclusion.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about what we may see in terms of some of the issues in the Republican convention. As you said, it has morphed over the years of what has been a traditional Republican. There's a lot. We hear about the border, southern border, inflation, part of the economy. Abortion has, in the past couple of years, has actually become more of a national issue. This will be the first national presidential campaign that will be more involved. How does the balance work when they're putting the platform together between and amongst the factions? And what I mean by that is both parties generally have, we'll take the Republicans, have really conservative Republicans, some that are more middle of the road, some that may even be a little more liberal than, those who are, not favorable for former President Trump will put MAGA in a different category all in itself.
Right.
How does that work out to try to appease those delegates who are there, who are going to vote on what the issues are, to make sure that all of their needs are sort of addressed?
Well, I think you bring up an excellent point, because what the platform is designed to do is to show what your party stands for, what you're supposed to be doing. And I think it's interesting that in the primary system as it's evolved, both parties tend to have to go more towards the Republicans, more conservative, to attract those voters and win the primary races, and the Democrats have to go more liberal to win their primary races. But then at the conventions, you try to come back more to the center, because you're always looking to try to attract maybe some of those, if you're looking at the Republican side, some moderate Democrats, the independents. So in this platform that they're going to be developing, I'm sure there's going to be something about abortion, as you said, but it's going to be something worded probably along the lines of that after the decision a few years ago from the Supreme Court, well, what we support is having the states make the decision. So more of a states' rights approach, if you will, in terms of that. As it comes to crime, I'm sure they're going to mention crime and tie it somehow to immigration or the border or those kinds of issues as well. There may be discussion about the border wall. So there'll be things in there trying to attract and really and gain support from all different factions at the same time. So that's where these platforms become almost all-encompassing, where you try to promise a little bit of something for everybody to try to bring them into your party, which obviously makes sense, because when you get to the general election, it's not just Republicans voting for, a Republican candidate or a Democrat, like in the primaries. You have to appeal to the general electorate if you hope to win the presidency. And that's where I think it's interesting with these platforms. And what also can tie in too is when you have third candidates, third party candidates like RFK Jr., who's in there now too. So what does that do to the platform? Because for the Republican platform, probably not much. But for the Democratic platform, it may have an impact, because he was a former environmentalist, and not former, but an environmentalist.
Democrat.
Right, Democrat, right. So that may have more of an impact on what the Democrats do to some extent, but we'll have to just wait and see.
We talked about how there's the two major parties, but you've got, some other third parties. What comes to mind? A Libertarian Party will sometimes put in a candidate. The Green Rainbow Party will do that. At these conventions, you mentioned how, they try to keep things general to try to tie in, at least in historical, some of those other parties back in. Are the Republicans going to maybe do that in some ways as well? Maybe not the Green Rainbow Party. They tend to be a little more progressive. But maybe look at the Libertarians and say, hey, we've got something here for you, that tend to be a little more right-leaning?
Absolutely. I mean, they would be foolish not to. And the Democrats the same way. I think both with the Green and Rainbow and the other parties that are on the other end of the spectrum. Absolutely. So no, I think you will see some of that in the party platforms themselves. And then what you will see, what the platform says, which is terrific, but then what you'll see is the other party will then challenge that and say, well, you say X, Y, and Z in the platform, but you really don't mean X, Y, and Z. We're the party that anyone who is interested in these issues really should be voting for, because even though you're saying this, you're not going to follow through with it, or if you follow through with it, it's going to be more severe, more draconian than what you actually than what people actually think before they vote.
Yeah, and when you look at the platform, I know that there's a platform committee that both parties have. Are those generally made up of some of those same delegates, or are those more party leaders that sort of, because I'm sure the discussions are happening right now. And just so you know, we're recording this the end of June, we're about 2.5 weeks or so, 3 weeks from when the Republican convention will start. I'm sure those discussions are happening now. So are delegates involved other than voting, or is it more like party bosses that will kind of drive that agenda?
It's more the party bosses still at this point. You know, the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee, those leadership, they have entire, you know, very elaborate bureaucracies set up with specific roles to play when the convention takes place. And you may see some of the delegates who are more influential, from more influential states, have more of a role to say in that. But a lot of these things will be done in anticipation of the convention, because again, this is all time to television. So you can't have these long drawn out platform debates like there was back in 1924 with the Democrats, where they actually took over 103 ballots before you actually had a nominee for the party. We can't see that happen anymore, because it opens on Monday, it's done by Thursday. So you've got to have someone chosen by that point, or else you're losing all of that great, you know, free advertising time basically on the networks and everything else.
And how much does a convention also provide face time, if you will, to some of the candidates down ballot? And what I mean by that is there's a lot of speakers. I don't know what the schedule is for the Republican convention or the Democrat convention, but usually, you know, used to be like around like noontime and go right through the evening. Now I think it starts later, but there's still a lot of speeches being done, and a lot of times it'll feature up and coming, right, candidates in that party. How important is that for those individuals? And also to give the viewers at home and the delegates a view of like, okay, former President Trump's the Republican nominee, but I see John Smith, who could be a good Republican down the line.
Down the line. Oh, this is absolutely critical. That's absolutely critical. And unfortunately, I don't have a good example from the Republican side, but I've got a couple of good ones from the Democratic side. Bill Clinton, for example, delivered a keynote address in 1988, for Michael Dukakis. And that catapulted him to be one of the potential nominees, even though he spoke way too long. They cut off his teleprompters, but he still kept going. He didn't stop. And then in 2004, John Kerry chose Barack Obama to come and deliver, and he just wowed the crowd, and he became an instant favorite, even though Hillary Clinton was still there, and that really cost her a great deal as well. So no, this can be incredibly significant, and you're exactly right. They go all day, these conventions, the speeches go all day, but you get, as you get closer to that prime time news, you know, time frame, 8 to 11 o'clock, that's when you get the real big heavy hitters, the people that get time because either they're very strongly committed to your candidacy, which is mostly the case, and also the people that you're trying to mend fences with and kind of bring on board. It's a nice way to kind of extend an olive branch, maybe from the primaries or other things, to say that, okay, now you support me and I want your followers to support me as well. So if I give you a good, you know, nice time frame there to kind of give your speech, it will help appeal and help me in that regard as well. So there's a lot of things, and it's all geared, as I said, I don't mean to come back to this, but it's all geared to the TV, the media, making that presentation, showing a united front, and hopefully you don't have chaos, you know, like it happens sometimes when there's protesters or other things outside or whatever.
That's it for this edition of FRC Media News. Please visit our website, frmedia.org, for all the latest news and local information. FRC Media News airs Thursdays at 6 p.m. and Fridays at 5:30 p.m. For all of us here at FRC Media News, I'm Keith Tebow. Enjoy the rest of your Independence Day holiday. We'll see you next Thursday.